imagine the 1940s, UK, United Kingdom, post-Second World War, terrible time. My grandparents had just returned back to grey, dismal, miserable, the Lake District area where they lived in England. After traveling, the one service that they did during the war was they joined something called ENSA, which was the Entertainment for the Troops, which brought them to India. That was their first encounter with India. And they traveled not only in India, they went to Southeast Asia and performed for troops across this incredible part of the world. And my grandparents fell in love, deeply, deeply, deeply in love with everything they experienced in India. So this wonderful, crazy grandfather of mine, who was an actor, and my grandmother, who was an actress, decided to create their own theatre company, and they called it Shakespeareana. And they found 14 actors, or must have been 12 actors, and they put them on a ship, and they sailed 2 weeks across the oceans to come back to India, having left. Actually, no, they took my mother, who was 13, out of school, having told the principal, asked the principal if she would excuse my mother for a year, and then she'd come back to school, of course. And the principal said, what better education than to take her to India? Of course, take her. My mother never went back to school, but that's another story. But what better education could she get? And they came to India with one performance booked. Can you imagine that? One show, that was it. But my grandfather had faith that he would be able to get more shows and make a life for himself in this country, a continent in those days, because they traveled right across this subcontinent. And they traveled here for 40 years, at least. They performed in this very school. And you were their audience as well, Mr. Kulkarni. So at the same time, you can imagine India during the 40s, 1944. You can imagine what was going on in this country, what people were feeling, what was the fervor, what was the emotion. At the peak of his film career, Prithvi Kapoor is now a really big star in Indian cinema of that time. He decides to give birth to his ultimate dream. And he creates Prithvi Theatres, his traveling theatre company, which travels around the length and breadth of India, taking Hindustani theatre to audiences across the country, talking of urgent issues that were burning up this country even before independence, talking about predicting partition, talking about the plight of farmers, talking about what money is going to do to the country if we let it get haywire. And this was his passion. The British company Shakespeareana and Prithvi Theatres. Shakespeareana did, of course, Shakespeare, but also modern classics of that time. And fortuitously, these two companies met in Calcutta. And that's very fortuitous for me, because that's where my parents met, and that's how come I'm here. But that's another story, how they met and what they did. But for me, just giving you that background that's where my childhood was filled with the most amazing stories of their theatre adventures. Both these actor managers with their theatre companies had such extraordinary experiences. Prithvi Kapoor with 150 people, 3 train bogies. Matlab everybody, the mochi, the silai wala, the khana pakane wala, sab log jate the. They would travel all over the country. Shakespeareana, a very modest, small, 14, 15 member theatre company. Very often would, as Shivani did, would come to a school and ask the students to participate in the play and stand in as little guards or walk in one-line dialogues. And that's how they performed. Very different types of theatre. So for me, theatre has always been my greatest passion, my greatest inspiration. Jeffrey Kendal was my inspiration because I was much closer to him. I was 5 when Prithvi Kapoor passed away, but my grandfather, Jeffrey Kendal, went on to, I assisted them and traveled with them, both my grandparents. I even acted with them when I was 12 on a tour in Ireland to schools and colleges in Ireland, performing Shakespeare with them, scenes of Shakespeare. But it was a life. It wasn't a job. And for me, that's what was thrilling. It was a life that was filled with adventure and excitement. My grandfather had the ability to describe the most mundane, boring hamburger and make it sound like the most exotic, divine, godly food. And this is what he did to me. He would make a trip to the post office. We would walk up this hill, and I would be all of 5, and we'd walk up Malabar Hill, which was one huge hill in Bombay. And it was an adventure. I was going to the post office. And he just had this ability to turn everything round and make it dramatic and extraordinarily wonderful. And I think, for me, that was really fortunate to have had that ability to experience somebody else's passion. And I think passion is something that rubs off when you're close to it. And so really, for me, the biggest learning is, for my 13-year-old child today, my biggest challenge is for him to find his passion. And I think that's what every school's job is, to allow you all, each one of you, to find your passion. And that's the challenge, that's the trick. And how do we do it? And as you heard, Ken Robinson, we're not equipped. We don't really know how to do it. I met a principal in Delhi recently who said there was a parent who was a brain surgeon, specialist, whatever the word is. And she'd done a study on her own child, which was an unobtrusive, very safe study of mapping the brain and what happens to the brain, the neurological synapses of your brain, when her child went through a festival in school, which was a reading week, and they were exposed to all this literature. And she said it was unbelievable, that everything just went alive. It was like Diwali suddenly happened in her brain. And now, so we're getting more and more scientific proof of what happens to you when you experience a creative outburst in your life, or a creative experience, and how completely essential it is in our lives, and not only for children, in our adult lives. We need it in our lives too. I'm going to tell you a little bit about other inspirations for me as well. My grandfather, of course, was my greatest inspiration. But I worked for 21 years at Prithvi Theatre, and for me, it was always a challenge to dream up an idea. My glamorous acting life is not really existent. I really push that aside, because I think the actor-manager part of my grandparents, the manager part is what also took over my life. And I decided, no, luckily I live in India, so we have many lives. So next life, I will be an actress. This life, I will be a manager, and that's what I am. But what I do, I dream up ideas of how the richness and the beauty of theatre can be experienced to huge numbers of people in many, many different and wonderful ways. And theatre is my base, but of course it encompasses all the arts with it. So now, with the new organization that I've recently, 4 years ago, and we're celebrating our first birthday on the 29th of February, which is very exciting, with Junoon, which is what it's called, and it encompasses everything that I believe, Junoon. We actually do this. We take these ideas and we plant them in different places across the country. But the idea of an institution bearing this responsibility is something that I hold very dear to my heart. And there are various institutions that have been inspirational for me, a lot of them, in fact, from southern countries. There is in Venezuela, perhaps you've heard about this, and you can look it up, and there have been TED Talks by the person who started them, a system called El Sistema, which is the most extraordinary music training system, which goes into the slums, the favelas of Venezuela, and has trained young people in music. And you've already got such an extraordinary music center here. It's so exciting to see, and the music that we've heard today. But these young people have been trained in music, which gives them such an extraordinary sense of self-worth and dignity. And what is really interesting is that it is a social movement. It is not just art for art's sake. And I don't really believe in that. I believe art is transformational. And it's transformational individually, but it's also transformational societally. It can impact everybody. So El Sistema has done the most amazing things. Today, you have musicians and conductors, composers that are the most coveted museums across the globe. But what it has done for the families the families of these children who live in slums, in squalor, with nothing. It has given them a sense of self-worth and dignity and pride. And that is truly valuable. That's the true value of what this has done, apart from giving everybody the joy of what music does. And we all know what that does in our lives. There's another example from Brazil, which is SESC, which are these cultural and sports community centers, which actually look at sports and culture at the highest level for everybody. And this is also a really amazing, amazing system that works in Brazil. And I dream of a day when we can incorporate these systems into urban India, where every urban center in India can boast of at least 30 such institutions across their map of their city. And this is the India we should be building. These are, the temples of tomorrow. I promise you that this is the world we need to have in our country. There is a third highly inspiring experience I had when I visited something called the Zip Zap Circus in Cape Town in South Africa. And I have always been fascinated with the circus. My father always took me to the circus on my birthday. And I think the sheer magic of what the human body can do, the feat, the absolute possibility of extraordinary, amazing, it's almost godlike for me. And what this circus does is it takes young children and trains them in circus skills. And these children belong to really rough areas in Cape Town. And they would be drug peddlers. They would be committing crimes. They would just turn into lumpen, useless contributors to society. But today, with the fact that they've got circus arts in their life, they are transforming possibility. And there is a new opportunity opening up for them. So Zip Zap Circus is another extraordinary engagement. There is now closer to home a most immediate inspiration for me, which is the painting of the Savai Madhopur railway station that my husband was also involved with. And these are local painters. They have been nurturing their talent of painting the most extraordinary wildlife in this realistic way, and now they have completely inhabited, I don't know how many square feet, 2,500 square feet or more, in the Savai Madhopur railway station. And it is extraordinary. You walk through, and what is extraordinary is that you see the villagers walking through and stopping, and of course taking selfies, which is great. But they suddenly, the sense of pride and value for them, कि ये अपना जंगल है भाई, अपना शेर है. And it's there. It's there for everybody to see in the most beautiful way. And it's not painting, something to sell. It's not painting you a toothpaste so that you can buy toothpaste tomorrow, but it's actually just painting a tiger or a bird or a tree, and to show you how beautiful that is. And what a beautiful sense of joy it can give you. And I hope this spreads like wildfire across all our railway stations across the country, and how magnificent that would be that we use local talent to share with the public at large. So that's the world I encompass. And to stress upon why I believe the arts are transformational and are so necessary, we celebrate on this 100th year Einstein's great discovery with this gravitational wave, which I could barely understand. But what was it that Einstein did every time he got stuck and he was working on some extraordinarily technical exploration? He played his violin, or he played the piano. And he was excellent at the violin and excellent at the piano. And then he would sit and write out what it was he was thinking about. We need to nurture these arts in our lives. We need to allow them in, and we need to say they are as important as are our sciences and our engineering and everything else that we need. Just imagine, and actually there's a paper I just recently read where Einstein would really not have been able to do what he did if he did not have music in his life. And how he said the music was the one thing that gave him the greatest joy, more joy than his scientific journeys. And that is why arts are so important. They must not be relegated to sort of the extra hobby, extracurricular areas of our lives. I'm going to end. Well, I don't know how much. I have time, no? I have time. You've lost track. Okay, I'm not going to end. I'm going to tell you one more story. There's Nasiruddin Shah, who was also in a boarding school like this, but not as beautiful as this, I imagine. And he was miserable in boarding school. And he discovered my grandparents. Shakespeareana would come to his boarding school. And he has spoken about this a lot, and he's talked about this a lot. And he writes in his book, and he's told me about this as well, how he would wait right through the year till Shakespeareana would arrive, and then for 8 days would stay in his school and perform. And he loved my grandfather, and he thought he was just the finest actor in the world. And in the 70s, or in the 80s, they got to meet. He actually spoke to my grandfather and said, "Why did you choose India? Why did you spend so many years here? What was it? You could have stayed in England. You were the greatest actor. You could have been knighted. You could have, got riches and accolades like Laurence Olivier or John Gielgud. What was it that kept you here?" And I don't think that was a question my grandfather had ever actually thought of. And so he paused and he said, "Well, I'm on a mission. I'm on a mission of spreading the joy of Shakespeare and theatre. And that's what I do, and I love it. And I love being here. And I love seeing the faces of these extraordinary," and he loved in particular the girl student in schools. He thought the Indian girl child student was the most extraordinary. She would sit there in rapt attention and absorb every word. Sorry, the boys were not as focused. But perhaps, perhaps I got easier when my grandfather produced two beautiful girls, and then the boys would pay attention. But I think for him it was a mission. It was sort of a missionary zeal that propelled him into being here. And it was that. I was recently just asked about what it was that, propels me. And I think there is this word success. And I've never thought of success in my life. I don't even think my generation has really thought of success. I think it's something you think you come to when you're about 60 or something. But you don't think of it now. But now you, the younger generation, want success like this. You want to know what success is all about immediately. And this is a shift we've seen in our world today. But I think for my grandfather, success was living his life on his terms, the way he wanted, at every point. Living his life, meeting people, traveling, engaging with cultures and with different people. And I grew up listening to stories of school principals. For me, that was part of the breakfast table conversation. These remarkable people. Gibson. That was a word. I grew up hearing about him, about what it meant to be a wonderful school principal. And I think that this, we need to find our passion. We need to find what it means to be successful for ourselves, very, very personally, and hold your passion really, really close to you. I'm going to end with something that my grandfather wrote in his book. He wrote a book called Shakespearewala, which is his autobiography. And he writes this beautiful passage, which I should learn by heart, but I haven't. And he says, "Being an actor must be the best job in the world. It combines all things that a person need look for. Health, romance, travel, the fun of the lottery, the positive tragedy of failure, and the will to overcome it. It provides good companionship and interest in literature, architecture, music, and dance. In short, just about everything most people strive for. But the theatre is female, and like all females, she will not be trifled with. She must be grasped with both hands and given one's whole self, body, and soul. If she is to be a proper mate, she must not be dallied with, or she will bite, and that bite will never heal." This might sound overdramatic, but it is true, and it may be seen over and over again. Thank you.